The walls of Ward 13 were thick and damp, as though they'd absorbed the suffering of the patients who once occupied its rooms. They loomed over me, pressing in like silent sentinels of madness. Somehow, through a clerical error or perhaps some grim twist of fate, I, Max, had been locked in here overnight. ID heard the whispers, the frightened stares from the other patients whenever someone was sent here. Ward 13 was a destination, a one-way ticket for those the staff wished to forget. It was quiet now, too quiet, as if the ward itself was holding its breath, waiting. I tried to distract myself by pacing, glancing at the shadowy corners, hoping for anything to break the silence. But the darkness was thick, almost tactile, reaching out to brush against my skin, sending shivers down my spine. Then, just at the edge of my vision, I noticed movement. I turned, but nothing was there. A chill crawled up my neck, prickling the hairs. A vague, electric tension filled the room, an undercurrent of something wrong. Slowly, I moved toward the door, jiggling the handle in the vain hope it would miraculously unlock, but it held firm. My hands grew clammy as the minutes stretched into an eternity of silence and shadows. And then, just as my mind started to fray, I saw it. A flash like a projector flickering to life. Before my eyes, a scene began to unfold in the center of the room. A man, hunched and trembling, sat on the floor, his face contorted in terror as he clawed at his arms, muttering frantically under his breath. His eyes were wide, frantic, darting around as though he could see something dreadful lurking nearby. He looked right through me, his fear so palpable I could feel it curling cold and heavy in my own stomach. The vision snapped out as suddenly as it had come, leaving me alone again in the oppressive silence. My heart pounded as I stumbled backward, my legs weak. Whatever this place was, it was showing me something I wasn't supposed to see. What had happened here? And who or what was next? A flicker of dim light crackled across the room, casting sinister shadows that seemed to shift and writhe of their own accord. I backed away slowly, pressing myself against the wall, hoping to avoid whatever phantoms Ward 13 was summoning. The silence thickened, almost becoming an entity itself, pressing down on me until each breath felt like a struggle. Just then, another vision erupted into existence, sharper, more vivid than the last. This time, it was a woman, curled up in a corner, clutching her knees to her chest as if trying to shield herself from something unseen. Her face, hollow and gaunt, bore the unmistakable scars of anguish and fear. Her lips moved soundlessly, her eyes darting, never resting on one spot for long. She whispered something, chanted, a fragmented mantra to herself, as though repeating it could ward off the horror surrounding her. Her voice rose to a frenzied pitch, each syllable choked and desperate, and as she screamed, her form began to shudder, like static on an old television set. Then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. The room fell back into silence, but her screams seemed to echo in the walls, resonating in the stale, musty air. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force the image from my mind, but it clung to me, clawing its way into my thoughts. I could still see her terror, still hear the hoarse, hopeless cries that had no one to answer them. I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls themselves were steeped in this despair, an echo of all the souls left to rot here, their agony imprinted on the very structure of the ward. And then I saw it, the door at the end of the hall, barely illuminated by the flickering light above it. Something in me told me to stay away, that whatever lay beyond was something I was never meant to know. But another part, a darker, more desperate part, compelled me forward. I took a step, then another, each footfall feeling like it echoed louder, reverberating down the hall as if the whole place were watching, waiting. The door loomed closer with each step, its chipped paint and rusted handle an ominous testament to years of neglect. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat thunderous in the silence, but some morbid curiosity, no, something deeper, darker, pulled me onward. I reached out, fingers brushing the cold metal, and felt a tremor of energy crawl up my arm. I hesitated, knowing somehow that opening this door would mark a point of no return. But before I could pull my hand away, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a narrow, dimly lit corridor stretching out into shadow. The air was different here, thick, damp, carrying a metallic tang that tasted like old blood. A primal dread clawed at me, warning me to turn back, but my feet moved of their own volition, carrying me forward. As I stepped into the hallway, a sensation washed over me, as if I were wading through a dense, invisible fog. My skin prickled, my breath shallow and quick. It felt as though the walls themselves were watching, leaning closer, eager to witness whatever twisted spectacle awaited. A faint glow flickered further down the hall, and I moved toward it, each step echoing hollowly. Shadows seemed to pulse and writhe at the edges of the light, forming shapes that twisted and changed, taking on grotesque, almost human forms. My head throbbed, visions bursting unbidden into my mind. Images of people, some familiar, others unrecognizable, all bearing the same expression of wide-eyed terror and despair. Suddenly, I heard a whisper, soft but unmistakable, drifting down the corridor toward me. Max. The voice was thin, rasping, as if it had clawed its way out of a long-buried grave. Who's there? My voice sounded weak, hollow against the oppressive silence. I took another step, and the whisper came again, closer, louder, filling my ears with a dreadful urgency. Turn back. It hissed, the words stretching and distorting, echoing off the walls until it was impossible to tell where they were coming from. But even as the voice warned me, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was also laughing. I tried to turn, to flee back down the hall, but my body wouldn't obey. I was trapped, locked in a gruesome march toward whatever lay at the end of this corridor. The corridor seemed to stretch longer with each step, as if mocking my every attempt to reach its end. Shadows crept along the walls, flickering in strange, erratic patterns that tugged at my peripheral vision. They seemed almost alive, writhing and squirming like dark, serpentine creatures. I could feel the weight of the air thickening, pressing down on me, filling my lungs with something stifling and heavy. And then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on metal. The sound grew louder, reverberating down the corridor, a slow, mocking cadence that matched the rhythm of my footsteps. My heart stammered, my mouth dry as ash. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run, but some dark compulsion drove me forward, closer and closer to the source of that dreadful sound. Then, just beyond the edges of the dim light, I saw it. A figure hunched and indistinct, as though cloaked in shadow. Its fingers, long and skeletal, tapped against the wall, each tap punctuating the silence with a terrible finality. The figure was cloaked in darkness, its face a blurred mask, but I could feel its gaze burning into me, piercing and cold. "Max?" it rasped, the voice barely more than a whisper, filled with an ancient, lingering malice. "They all come here in the end." I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came. My body was frozen, every muscle locked in place as the figure tilted its head, studying me with a sickening curiosity. It felt like it was peeling away every layer of my being, seeing not just my fear, but my deepest memories, my buried regrets, my darkest secrets. The shadows around it shifted and swirled, coalescing into faces, dozens, hundreds of faces, all twisted in agony, their eyes wide and unseeing, mouths stretched open in silent screams. They pressed closer, crowding the walls, filling the corridor with their sorrow, their pain, their despair. Each face looked at me, pleading, accusing, as if blaming me for their suffering. And then, in a single horrifying instant, they all spoke in unison, their voices a tortured cacophony. "You're one of us now, Max." My vision blurred, the walls closing in, the air thick with the stench of decay. I staggered backward, desperate to escape, but the faces followed, their empty eyes boring into me, consuming me. Somehow, I broke free of their gaze and stumbled back down the corridor, gasping for air, but I knew now. This wasn't just a place of confinement. It was a place of eternal suffering, a purgatory from which no soul could escape. I stumbled blindly through the darkened hall, feeling the weight of countless eyes on my back. The whispers grew louder, no longer fragmented but now a steady, agonizing chant. Words I couldn't understand, words that felt ancient, their syllables clawing at my sanity, pulling me down into some void I could not see but could feel, like a heavy, malevolent presence in the air. My vision wavered, a dizzying haze settling over me as the walls seemed to close in, twisting and contorting. I reached out, trying to steady myself, but my hand met only the cold, wet stone of the wall. It was slick beneath my fingers, as though coated in something thick and oily. My stomach lurched as a metallic stench filled my nostrils, a smell that reminded me of old blood, left to rot. Then, without warning, the lights flickered on, bathing the corridor in a sickly yellow glow. I wished they hadn't, for scattered down the length of the hall were remnants, signs of those who had been here before me. Scratches lined the walls, deep and desperate, as if fingernails had clawed at the stone until they bled. I saw fragments of fabric, a torn sleeve here, a scrap of something once white, now stained dark and brittle. And then, the writing, scrawled across the walls, in what looked disturbingly like blood, were messages left by those who had come before. No way out. He sees you. Run, but you'll never escape. Each message was more frantic, more despairing than the last, the handwriting growing sloppier, wilder, as though the author had descended into madness before they could finish. As I scanned the wall, one message stood out. It was fresh, as if someone had just written it. I leaned closer, the letters blurring as I struggled to focus, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Max, leave while you can. The blood drained from my face. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. How did they know my name? Every instinct urged me to flee, to turn and run as fast as my legs could carry me. But before I could make a move, the walls seemed to shudder, the air vibrating with a low, ominous hum. And then, slowly, the corridor began to fill with mist, a dense, creeping fog that coiled around my ankles, curling up my legs like the grasping fingers of the dead. The mist was thick and cold, chilling me to the bone as it swirled around me, obscuring the floor, the walls, everything. And within that fog, I could see them. Faint, ghostly figures, faces twisted in expressions of anguish, of betrayal. They moved silently, drifting closer, their hands outstretched as though begging for salvation. But there was no warmth, no humanity in their eyes, only a hollow emptiness, a void that seemed to draw me in, tugging at my soul, whispering to me of things I dared not understand. I backed away, trembling, but as I moved, so did they. Closer and closer, the fog thickening until it was all I could see, all I could breathe. And through that dense, suffocating mist, one figure emerged, more solid, more real than the others. It was the woman I'd seen before, the one huddled in the corner. But now she was standing, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes fixed on me with a look of hollow rage. "You're not supposed to be here, Max," she whispered, her voice echoing like a scream in the dark. "You should never have come here." The mist thickened, swallowing her form, but her eyes remained, two burning embers that seared into my mind, branding themselves into my memory. And then, with a sudden, violent force, the mist surged forward, enveloping me, pulling me under into the darkness. The darkness was absolute. I was floating, lost in a void with no sense of up or down, my heart pounding, each beat louder than the last. Then, slowly, I became aware of a weight pressing down on me, a suffocating heaviness that made breathing nearly impossible. The darkness wasn't empty. It was dense, tangible, and it seemed to be seeping into my skin, crawling under my flesh, filling my veins with a chill that spread like ice. And then, like a mirage rising out of nothingness, I saw the faint outline of a room, a single, flickering light casting weak, stuttering shadows against the walls. It was a hospital room, but it felt wrong, too empty, too quiet. A thin, low hum filled the air, a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I didn't want to move closer, but something compelled me, tugging me forward until I was standing just outside the door, peering in. The room was empty, save for a single hospital bed in the center. Straps lay across the bed, as though waiting for someone to be restrained. A faint stain on the mattress told a grim story, dark, dried patches that hinted at violent struggles, at lives that ended here in silence and despair. I swallowed, my throat dry as sandpaper. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn away, to run. But before I could react, the room flickered, the walls warping, shifting. And suddenly, I wasn't looking into an empty room anymore. A figure lay strapped to the bed, a man with hollow eyes and skin as pale as death. He was thrashing, pulling against the restraints, his mouth open in a soundless scream. His gaze locked onto mine, and I felt an icy spike of terror pierce me. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but his expression said everything: fear, desperation, and something darker, a deep, abiding hatred. "Help me," his lips mouthed, over and over, his eyes wide, pleading. His arms strained against the straps, veins bulging as he writhed, trying to break free. And then, his head snapped to the side, and I saw it. A shadow creeping along the wall, a twisted, grotesque shape that seemed to shift and pulse, like a living wound. The shadow loomed closer, stretching across the floor until it hovered over the man. His thrashing grew more frantic, his face contorting in terror as the shadow descended, merging with him, seeping into his skin like a dark, spreading stain. His body went rigid, his eyes wide and unseeing, and then he went still, deathly still. I stumbled back, gasping, my hand flying to my mouth as I fought back the urge to scream. The room flickered again, and he was gone. The bed was empty, the straps hanging loosely, swaying as though they had just been released. A voice whispered in my ear, soft and venomous. "You'll take his place, Max, just like all the others." I spun around, but there was no one there. Only the darkness pressing in closer and closer. And somewhere in that darkness, I could feel the presence watching, waiting for me to succumb, to give in to the creeping, paralyzing terror that had taken root in my mind. This wasn't just a nightmare. Ward 13 wasn't just a place of confinement. It was something much darker. A place where shadows lived, feeding on fear, on pain, on the very souls of those trapped within its walls. And now it had its sights set on me. The darkness was absolute. I was floating, lost in a void with no sense of up or down, my heart pounding, each beat louder than the last. Then, slowly, I became aware of a weight pressing down on me, a suffocating heaviness that made breathing nearly impossible. The darkness wasn't empty. It was dense, tangible, and it seemed to be seeping into my skin, crawling under my flesh, filling my veins with a chill that spread like ice. I staggered backward, desperate to put distance between myself and that accursed room. But as I turned, I found the hallways had twisted, rearranged themselves like the shifting pieces of a labyrinth. I was no longer sure which direction I'd come from. Each corridor stretched endlessly, vanishing into shadows that seemed to breathe and ripple with unseen life. My breaths came shallow and fast, each step forward swallowed by the heavy silence. The air had grown thick with something sour, a scent that crawled up my throat like rot mixed with chemicals. It clung to my skin, soaked into my clothes. I forced myself onward, the walls narrowing, pressing in until I felt like I was walking through a vein, trapped within the pulsing, breathing body of this place. I didn't know how long I walked, but then, out of the silence, a new sound emerged. A faint, wet scraping, like nails dragging slowly across concrete. I froze, straining to hear, my heartbeat roaring in my ears. The sound grew louder, closer, until I could make out the rough breathing that accompanied it. A ragged, uneven rhythm that matched the scraping in a terrible, intimate way. And then I saw him. A man crawled out of the shadows, his hands raw and bloody, his fingers worn down to nubs as he dragged himself forward. His eyes were wild, hollowed-out pits of madness and terror, fixed on something beyond this world. He wore the tattered remnants of what might have once been a hospital gown, but it was soaked through, clinging to his skeletal frame like a second skin. His body was gaunt, bones visible beneath the stretched, translucent flesh, each movement labored, painful. "Help me," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper, choked and wet. I took a step back, fear clawing at my gut, but his gaze snapped to mine, and his eyes, they bore into me with an intensity that paralyzed me. I felt the weight of his suffering, his despair. A lifetime of torment compressed into that single, agonized stare. Before I could react, he reached out, his hand grasping at my ankle, cold and damp. His grip was weak, but I felt a terrible strength behind it, a desperation that went beyond words. He tried to pull himself closer, his mouth opening and closing as he mouthed something, a silent scream that echoed in my mind. "You have to leave before it takes you," he managed, his voice barely more than a ragged whisper. It feeds on us. It keeps us here forever." The shadows behind him began to writhe, forming into a dense, shifting mass. Dark tendrils extended from it, reaching out, slithering across the floor toward him. His eyes widened in terror as he saw them, his grip on my ankle loosening.
"No."
"No, please," he whimpered, trying to pull away, but it was too late. The tendrils wrapped around him, pulling him back into the shadows, his body twisting, contorting in ways that made my stomach churn. His face was the last thing I saw, frozen in a final, silent scream, before he was swallowed by the darkness. I staggered back, my mind reeling, bile rising in my throat. The air around me grew colder, denser, filled with the faint, lingering scent of decay and something else. Something primal, ancient, a hunger that permeated every inch of this cursed place. And then, from the depths of the shadows, a voice echoed, low and dripping with malice. "You cannot escape, Max. You are part of us now." The walls began to close in again, the corridors shrinking, twisting into endless, suffocating loops. I turned, desperate to find a way out, but every path led me deeper, the shadows growing thicker, the air colder, until I could feel it, pressing against my skin, clawing its way into my mind. Ward 13 wasn't just a place. It was alive and it wanted me. I ran, my footsteps echoing down the narrowing hallways as if chased by a ghostly crowd, each whispering my name. Every turn only led me to another identical corridor, walls creeping closer, doors staring at me with darkened windows like hollow, unseeing eyes. My breath came in ragged gasps, and the air grew colder, biting into my skin, leaving a faint layer of frost on the walls around me. Just when I thought I might collapse, I skidded to a halt in front of a door marked Records Room. It was ajar, a thin, ghostly light leaking out from within. A part of me recoiled, but something about it felt different from the other doors, as if this room held answers that might lead me out of this nightmare. I pushed the door open slowly, my hand trembling as it met the cold metal. Inside, the room was cramped and cluttered, filled with filing cabinets and boxes piled high with thick folders. The smell was sharp and stale, a mix of old paper and something metallic that lingered in the back of my throat. Dust danced in the thin beam of light, which seemed to emanate from a single, flickering bulb overhead. I stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind me. I jumped, my pulse hammering in my ears, but nothing stirred, just silence and the hum of the light above. The files were stacked haphazardly, some spilling open, their pages yellowed and brittle. I reached for the nearest one, my fingers grazing the edge, and as I did, a chill ran through me, colder than the air. My hands moved on their own, trembling as they opened the file, revealing a series of grainy, black and white photographs. The images hit me like a punch to the gut. Each photo showed a patient strapped to a bed, their faces contorted in terror, eyes wild with the horror of whatever they had seen. Notes were scrawled in the margins in thick, looping script, unresponsive, deterioration accelerating. Subject claims to see shadow figures. My hands began to shake uncontrollably as I flipped through more pages, each one documenting the descent of these patients into madness. Patients who had been confined to Ward 13. Each record described similar symptoms. Hallucinations, whispering voices, a cold presence that seemed to stalk them wherever they went. And then I found it, my own file. My name, scrawled in the same looping script, stared back at me, and beneath it, a single, chilling note. Transfer complete. Subject is adapting to environment. The world seemed to tilt, my vision blurring as the words sunk in. Transfer? Adapting? I backed away from the file, while rising in my throat as a sickening realization settled over me. I hadn't been trapped here by accident. They'd brought me here. I was meant to be here, part of some twisted experiment, condemned to become one of them. Another lost soul in the endless darkness of Ward 13. The shadows in the corners of the room began to thicken, creeping toward me, and the whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices overlapping, pleading, cursing, laughing. I stumbled back, my shoulder hitting the door, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows closed in, swirling around me, cold tendrils brushing against my skin, seeping into my mind, my bones. No, I whispered, my voice cracking. No, this can't be real. The shadows tightened, coiling around me like vines, pressing, squeezing, and in the darkness, I heard it again. A voice, soft, mocking, laced with a hunger that felt endless. You belong to us now, Max, forever. With a final, desperate scream, I felt the shadows consume me, pulling me down, into the cold, suffocating darkness, where the whispers of Ward 13 would echo forever. The darkness swallowed me whole, thick and suffocating, pressing down on me from all sides. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe. It was as if Ward 13 itself had taken me in, absorbed me into its twisted, malevolent heart. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me, each voice carrying a thread of despair, of desperation, of endless, hollow suffering. I fought against it, thrashing in the dark, but the shadows were everywhere, seeping into my mind, into my very soul, filling me with images I couldn't escape. Faces flashed before me, twisted, contorted faces of the ones who had come before, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes wide and empty. They were all there, prisoners of this endless nightmare, lost souls bound to the ward for eternity. And then, just as my mind began to fracture under the weight of it all, I felt a flicker of warmth. It was faint, a tiny spark, like the last ember of a dying fire, but it was enough to pull me back, to give me a sliver of hope. I focused on it, clinging to it, drawing myself up from the depths of the shadows, forcing myself to push against the darkness. Slowly, painfully, the shadows began to recede, peeling back layer by layer until I could see again. I found myself standing in the corridor outside the records room, the hallway dimly lit by that same sickly yellow light. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, I wondered if it had all been a hallucination, some trick of my mind. But then I looked down at my hands, trembling, stained with a dark, oily residue that seemed to pulse, almost alive. I backed away, horrified, but a sound stopped me. A low, rhythmic tapping, coming from just down the hall. It was slow, deliberate, echoing off the walls in a steady, dreadful cadence. My heart hammered as I followed the sound, each step feeling like it carried me closer to some inevitable, horrifying truth. And then I saw him. At the end of the hallway stood a figure, his face hidden in shadow, but his outline was unmistakable, thin, gaunt, with a posture that spoke of years of pain and confinement. He turned toward me slowly, and when his eyes met mine, I felt a chill unlike anything I'd ever known. His gaze was empty, hollow, like he'd long since abandoned any hope of escape. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice barely more than a rasp, but it echoed, filling the corridor with a chilling resonance. "Once you enter Ward 13, it never lets you leave." I tried to speak, to ask him who he was, but the words caught in my throat. He stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate, and as he drew near, I realized with a sickening jolt of horror that his face, it was my own. He reached out, his hand cold and clammy, his fingers brushing against mine, and in that instant, a flood of memories surged through me, not just my own, but his. I saw myself, trapped here, day after day, year after year, fading into the shadows, becoming one with the ward, another lost soul in its endless halls. "You're me?" I whispered, the realization cutting through me like a knife. "Or, I'm going to become you." The figure nodded slowly, his expression twisted in sorrow, in regret. "It's already happening, Max. You're part of Ward 13 now. Forever." The room began to spin, the walls shifting and warping, the shadows creeping closer, ready to pull me under. I stumbled back, trying to escape, but the figure was gone, vanished into the dark. I ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor, the whispers rising around me, louder, more insistent, until they filled my mind completely. And as the darkness closed in, I realized the horrifying truth. I was trapped, bound to Ward 13, destined to become another ghost haunting its endless halls, reliving the nightmare over and over, forever. There would be no escape. I had become part of the ward, and Ward 13 had become part of me.